several steps for U.S. policy. Number one, we need to cut off the funding that has enabled this attack to happen. And what is so infuriating is that over the last 2.5 years, Joe Biden and the Biden administration have flowed nearly $100 billion to Iran. Understand, Hamas is a proxy for Iran. Without Iran, there would be no Hamas.
That's
the
right.
Wall Street Journal has reported that this attack was planned by Iran, was funded by Iran, was directed by Iran, and yet the Biden administration continues to allow billions and billions of dollars to flow to the Ayatollah to be used to murder Israelis and to murder Americans. Well, and what you just mentioned with Rob Malley remains one of the greatest national security scandals in our nation's history. So Rob Malley was Joe Biden's chief negotiator for Iran. He's an incredible Iran sympathizer. He is an advocate, a passionate advocate for the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal, but he also has extraordinarily bad judgment. He's been fired. He's had his security clearances stripped, which I want you to pause and think, just how bad does his conduct have to be to have his security clearances pulled by this ideological and radical White House? But we now know also that, among other things, 3 of Rob Malley's top advisors, his inner circle, that he relied on, were Iranian operatives. They were recruited by the government of Iran. They were directed by the Iranian foreign minister. They reported to the Iranian foreign minister. We have their emails now in which they discuss, one of them discusses with the foreign minister that his loyalties are with the government of Iran, and he is there to do whatever they direct, including making the message from within the federal government that there's nothing wrong with Iran having a nuclear stockpile. You literally had 3 Iranian spies working in senior positions directly around the U.S. government. One of them, as far as we know, remains a chief of staff in the Department of Defense to this day with access to classified documents. And yet the corporate media cannot be brought to mention that 3 Iranian spies were brought into senior levels of government with access to classified materials while working directly for Iran, the same Iran that just murdered 31 Americans and 1,400 Israelis, the same Iran directed by an Ayatollah who regularly leads mobs chanting, "Death to America and death to Israel." Jewish. They violently raped women and young girls, publicly parading them in the street. They murdered and decapitated and burned alive toddlers and infants. They violently raped women and young girls, publicly parading them in the street. They murdered and decapitated and burned alive toddlers and infants. This is horrific and it is evil. Taught our enemies that the worse they are, the more money Joe Biden will give you. You know, I mentioned the $100 billion, and it's worth focusing on that for a moment. A lot of folks now are talking about the $6 billion. The $6 billion got a lot of coverage. That the Biden administration spent $6 billion that was essentially ransom money to free 5 American hostages. Now, at the time that happened, I said publicly, many others said publicly, this is terrible policy. You're effectively putting a bounty on the heads of Americans. You're telling bad guys, we'll pay you $1.2 billion a person for every American hostage that you have. And I predicted at the time, our enemies will take more American hostages, and Iran, because of this bounty, will take more American hostages. They now have roughly 200 Israeli hostages and about a dozen American hostages. So I'm sorry to say that prediction came through within weeks. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the money that went to Iran. Before the $6 billion, the Biden administration sent $10 billion that went from Iraq to Iran. And the biggest pot of money deals with the refusal of the Biden administration to enforce oil sanctions. U.S. law puts tough oil sanctions on Iran. Biden came in, immediately stopped enforcing them. Today, Iran is selling 2 million barrels a day of oil. That has produced $80 billion, roughly, in revenue. That is funding these Hamas death squads. That is funding the rockets. That is funding terrorism. And the Biden administration, something that he could do today. He gave a speech last week. You know what was not in the speech? saying we're going to enforce the oil sanctions and we're going to cripple the Iranian regime and take away their money, that's still Joe Biden and the Democrats have still proven unwilling to do.
That's a great point. And it was just stunning to me to understand the fact that while this administration was actually negotiating to pay money for those hostages, the Iranians were actually planning on taking more hostages. And that is exactly what they did. They unfroze the money, they went in, and Hamas went in and took more hostages. That is exactly what happened. I want to get your take.